Hello, everybody. My name is Abraham Bedoy, and I'm the Legal Outreach Coordinator with the Immigrant Legal Resource Center. Welcome to our second video of our two-part series of just talking a little about DACA, updates on DACA, an overview of the DACA program, and some helpful next steps potential DACA recipients can take. In our first video, if you weren't able to tune in, I invite you folks to watch it. We gave an update about DACA and again gave some practical next steps for potential DACA recipients. In this second video, though, we're going to do a deep dive in how folks exactly can apply for DACA through documentation. As we've heard many times in the community, folks are just a little bit confused on what documents are needed or how exactly they could prove every requirement related to DACA through documents. Before moving on, I'm going to just introduce my colleague, Veronica Garcia, who is a staff attorney with the ILRC, but also our DACA team lead. Veronica, excited to be with you. How are you?
I'm good, Abraham. I'm excited to be here too and go over some of these requirements that could seem a little daunting, but hopefully through this video we could explain a little more on how people could go about gathering some evidence so they could submit their DACA applications.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you uplift that sort of applying for DACA for the first time. I think submitting any application to the government, especially related to immigration, could be very, very intimidating, very just a lot of haze related to that. So I think that just thank you for being with us and hopefully lightening the blow a little bit of applying for DACA for the first time. Before we get into documentation and what documents are needed, I think it'd be helpful if we could just do, again, a quick run through all the requirements just so we're all on the same page. And before we do a deep dive, would you mind just again going over the requirements for folks who are tuning into this video for the first time and maybe completely new to DACA?
Yeah, definitely. So DACA is a program that's open to individuals who meet 7 program requirements. In order to apply for DACA, some people or the individual has to show that they were born after June 15, 1981 or under 31 on June 15, 2012. They have to show that they entered the United States before the age of 16, that they've been continuously residing in the United States since June 15, 2007, that they were physically present the day that the program was announced, which was June 15, 2012, that they were undocumented on June 15, 2012, that they're either currently in school or have completed school or met the educational requirement, and that they haven't been convicted of certain crimes.
Thank you. Thank you for that overview. The first thing I think DACA recipients will probably have to do, and correct me if I'm wrong, is probably prove their own identity or prove that they themselves are applying. I think sometimes folks just think a passport is what they need to submit, or maybe a marriage certificate or something like that. But if you wanted to prove your age and your identity, because I know you talked about being a certain age to be able to apply for DACA, what are some documents potential DACA recipients could submit to prove that particular requirement, the age, but also prove that they are themselves?
Yeah, so like we've talked about, in the first video with a little more detail than like I just mentioned, right? There's 7 requirements that people have to meet, right? That they have to show that they meet them for USCIS to grant them DACA, right? For the government to grant them DACA. Right? The first thing is showing that they meet the age requirements and that they are the person who is submitting this application. Most people think that the only way to show this is by submitting a passport, right? And a lot of people, if they got here when they were very young and they've never left the United States, they haven't seen the need to get a passport. So right now they're wondering, should I go and get a passport before I apply, or are there other ways to actually meet this requirement? Outside of a passport, if you have one, great. You can use that to show that you are who you are and that you are the age you say you are, and submit that with your DACA application. It doesn't matter that your passport might be expired now. You don't have to get a new one. You could use that one. But if you don't have that, right, and you don't have the ability to get one at the moment, you could also use your birth certificate with a photo ID, right? That photo ID could be your school ID, right? It could be other types of government ID that you might have been given. To show that you are who you are and that you are the age that you are. Just a quick note around the birth certificate. If you are like myself, right, and you were born in another country, right? I was born in Mexico. My birth certificate is in Spanish. Before I submit it to USCIS, I would need to get that translated. It has to be in English for USCIS to accept it, right? So if you don't have a passport, you could use a birth certificate. Just make sure that it's translated into English and that you use it with a photo ID, right? So that they know that it's you who is submitting. If you don't have that, you could also use a national identity document, right? So, for example, the Mexican government gives out matriculas, right? So, or like an ID from the Mexican government, you could also use that. If you have other U.S. government, document, if you've maybe had a different type of status or you had a work permit in the past, you could also use that to show that you are the individual that you are. Or if you are one of the few people who might have been in the U.S. military and they gave you a military ID, you could also use that. This document, the government just basically wants to see that you are the age, right, that you need to be in order to apply for DACA, right, so that you meet that requirement and that you are the person submitting the application.
Great. I think another requirement that folks are sometimes can be a little bit stuck on is I know you have to prove that you enter the United States before the age of 16, right? So how exactly would you advise or our partners are advising community members to prove this document? Because again, I think that like we mentioned in the first video, if these documents aren't well documented or these requirements are not well documented, it could present a problem for potential DACA recipients. So what advice or what sort of documents could DACA recipients or potential DACA applicants, expect to sort of prove this requirement?
Yeah. And, showing that you arrived before the age of 16 could be a little tricky, right? When I think about all the documents that people have to put together in order to submit a DACA application, it's a little daunting, right? Because who keeps proof of all this, right?
Yeah.
Especially now during quarantine, it's like, I don't know what I did yesterday, right?
Yeah.
Kind of thing. So proving 14 years is hard. And especially those who arrived when they were very young, right? How do you show that you were here before the age of 16? The easiest way that people go about showing this is if they got here when they were very young and they enrolled in school, they could show that they meet this arriving before the age of 16 by submitting their school records, right? It could be a transcript, it could be an enrollment sheet, it could be an attendance record that shows the date, right, in which it was created, right? So if I got here in April of 2005, and that's when my parents enrolled me in school, I would submit that. That it shows my name, right? So Veronica Garcia, and that it shows my birthday, right? So that USCIS knows that when I enrolled in school in April of 2005, I was, 5 years old, right? So my birthday, all of that corresponds. That's a way of showing it. We know that some people arrived when they were older, right? And maybe they didn't enroll in school right away, so they don't have that documentation. For those older individuals or maybe individuals that didn't enroll in school right away, you could also show maybe any travel document that you have. We know some people came in on a tourist visa, right? And their passport was stamped when they first entered the United States. You could show that as proof that you arrived before the age of 16, right? This will also have your name. It will have the date when you entered the United States, and it will have your birthday so that they know that it was before the age of 16. If you don't have that, you could also show medical records, right? So if you were vaccinated here in the United States when you were young, you could also submit that. If you went to the doctor, you could also submit that. If maybe you traveled on a bus, right? If you first got here and you were in San Diego, but then you were going to go with your family to Oregon, right? And you bought a bus ticket, you could also submit that. Any document that you submit should have, like I mentioned, your name, hopefully, your birthday, and hopefully the date that when it was created so that they could correspond and see that. We know that a lot of people in the community speak about maybe getting a letter from someone, right? Some people might say, oh, I started working when I was, 14 and I never went to school. Can I use a letter from my employer to show that I arrived here before the age of 16? That's not the best type of evidence to use, right? USCIS would want something that's created at that time because they just want to prevent someone just creating a letter. Not that someone would do that, right? But they would want something that's created from that time.
Great. Thank you, Vero. Another requirement is, I know you mentioned this, in being unlawful when the program was announced, which was the 15th of June of 2012. How exactly does a community member go about proving that? Or is it required for them to prove that? Or is it sort of assume that if you're applying without status, that you don't need to prove that, or maybe for some folks it requires more documentation, or I don't know if you could just speak a little bit to that.
Yeah. So, in order to be eligible for DACA, like we mentioned, you have to have no status on the day that the program was announced, June 15, 2012. For people who came without permission, we're going to say, right? So people who entered without being inspected, right, or speaking to an immigration officer, for those individuals, we would say that they entered without inspection, right? Those individuals never had lawful status, so they won't have to submit anything, right? So if you came in to the United States and didn't have permission to come into the United States, then you could just write on your application that you entered with no lawful status and leave it at that. For people who entered on a tourist visa, let's say, or other type of visa into the United States, who had their passport stamp or were given a little card called the I-94 by an immigration official, or a border patrol officer, right, when they flew into the United States, those people would have to submit their I-94 or other documents showing that their status had expired, right, on the day that the program was actually announced. And for a lot of people, that's the case, right? They entered when they were very young, and they just stayed here, right? And they were only given a permit to be here for 6 months, let's say. And that little card will show that that's the case, right? That they are no longer in status. So you have to submit that. So I guess you could think about it in like two groups, right? Those that came in with no permission, those don't have to submit any document to show they were out of status. But those who came with permission, with a visa or a tourist visa, they will have to submit something, either the stamp on their passport or the I-94 card, to show that their status had expired when the program was announced.
Great. Thank you, Veronica. The next requirement that sometimes may be daunting for folks, or there may be a little bit confusion, is the education requirement. I think sometimes folks could think that you need to be a high school graduate or be in high school to be able to apply for DACA. But I think that's a misconception that we debunked in our first video. So again, I want to invite folks to tune into that first video. But can you just explain how can folks go about proving, A, if they've graduated from high school, graduated from a GED program, or have a GED program completion certificate, or if they're attending school right now, like what sort of documents should folks be scouting for to submit for their DACA application?
Yeah, definitely. I want to start off by saying, exactly that, Abraham. A lot of people think that you have to currently be in school in order to apply for DACA, and that's not the case, right? So people who graduated high school, even if you're not in school right now, you are eligible to apply for DACA because you meet this educational requirement, right? You have graduated from high school. You could show you graduated from high school. So it doesn't matter that you're not enrolled in an university, that you're not enrolled in college at the moment that you apply, nor do you have to go and enroll in college, right? If you've completed the GED program, right, and have a certificate of completion, you could also use that to show that you meet the educational requirement. You don't have to go and enroll in a new GED program or a new high school finishing program in order to apply for DACA. Also, if you completed a literacy program or a career training program and you have certification of that and it meets the requirements of the program to be held up to what an education requirement is, then you could also submit proof of that, and then you're ready to go. Usually, when you submit this document, right, this document will show the day that you completed the program. And when you fill out your DACA application, the I-821D, in the section for education, you will put that you have graduated, right, or you completed a type of program, and then you would put the date in which you completed, right? So if I graduated high school in May of 2020, then I would put May 2020, right? So those are the ones if you're done. If you're currently in school, right, so right now you are either in adult school completing your high school diploma, right, or you're currently enrolled in a GED program or a vocational program or some sort of literacy program that meets education requirements. For those, you will have to show that you are actively enrolled and actively attending school, right? You could do this by a letter from the administrator, right, someone who is the director or the principal of a program that shows, they say, yes, X person is enrolled. You could do this with a class schedule, right? Saying these are the days that I go to school. You could do it with a plan of when you are going to complete the program, right? So if I just enrolled in a GED program today, I could show that I'm going to attend classes for X amount of dates or X amount of months, and I will have taken the final test by May of 2021, and I will be done, right? So you could show that you're in the progress of doing that. For some vocational programs and some literacy programs, you're going to have to show a little bit more of the purpose, right? Because USCIS will want to make sure that it's a type of program that they consider enough to to meet the educational requirement. And for that, in the letter you get from the director or the leader of the program, you could say what the purpose of the program is, and also who the contact information is, right, for that program.
Great. Thank you, Veronica, for that information. I think the last question, I think we kind of purposely saved this requirement for last because we hear a lot of confusion and a lot of the difficulty it is to sort of prove that continuous presence, since, excuse me, June 15th of 2007, to be specific. Could you give some tips or some guidelines? I know folks sometimes think that transcripts, that's the easiest way to do it. But we understand that there's some folks who didn't go to school, or some folks want to use pay stubs, or some folks who have never worked, they've never worked before, so they don't have those sort of documents to prove that continuous residence. So can you just give some tips for folks besides the stereotypical transcripts, pay stubs, of other ways folks could prove that continuous residence since June 15, 2007? And also the physical presence requirement, which is the same date as well, that you have to be physically present in the United States.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to take that in parts because it is definitely daunting, right, to prove that you've been here for 14 years. Yeah. Like I mentioned earlier, right, I don't know if I could prove that I've been here for, 2 months kind of thing, right, because life happens. You don't always keep documentation that you get or receipts from things that you've paid. So it becomes a little harder, right? So the first thing I want to talk about when we talk about continuous residence and physical presence is the documents that you submit should have your name, right? Should have the date in which it was created, right? And then it should also have something that identifies that it was created here in the United States, right? A lot of people, like you mentioned, Abraham, they use receipts, they might use pay stubs, they use school transcripts, right? It's the easiest way to show that you've been here for many years. To submit this, and USCIS accepts those, right? I also want to state that when we think about submitting documents, a lot of people think that they only have to submit one document per year, right? So one document for 2007, one for 2008, et cetera, et cetera. That's not the case. The best practice is to submit one document for every 3 months of the year that you're trying to prove, right? So if I have a document for January 2008, but I can't find something for February or for March, maybe that's okay, right? Because then I have something for April, right, in 2008. And you could go and skip maybe 2 months and be okay with that, right? So best practice is to have one piece of document for every 3 months, right? If you have one for every month of every year, great, submit those. But if you have some gaps, that could also be okay. Also, if you have a document, right, for maybe a few months out of the year, but you have some gaps that are like 5 months long or maybe 4 months long, there is a possibility that you would be able to submit a letter from someone that could say that you have been here for that time. And that will kind of help to supplement the other documents that you already have, right? So you can't use a letter alone, but you could use it to kind of fill in those gaps in case you're having trouble with completing the 14 years, right? So that's kind of like in general what documents are. Like you mentioned, Abraham, most people use school records, right? Because a lot of people got here when they were very young and they've been enrolled in school in the United States since they were 5 years old, right? So that's easy. They could show, that they went to elementary school here, that they went to high school here, that they went to middle school here, that they might be in college right now. So all of that is enough to show that they've been here. And they don't have to worry about it, right? What becomes difficult is for those people who came here when they were older, right? So they don't have, records completely for school, or they don't have records, a lot of records from school because, they came, they did high school, then they graduated and they started working. For those people, we have seen community members use, like you mentioned, employment records. We have seen them use pay stubs, right? Another thing that a lot of people use is cell phone bills, right? So everybody has a cell phone these days. If the cell phone bill is under your name, you could use that. We get one every month, right? So you could print that out and show that you've been here. Another thing that people use are bank statements. So if you have a bank account, you could print those out and also show that you've been here. We've seen people use kind of like car payments, right? So if you got a car here in the United States and you've been paying that car for the last 5 years, you could print out the receipt notices for those payments that you've made and submit them with your application. You could also use any medical records that you might have. So if you were vaccinated here, you could submit those vaccine records. If you had children here and you were going to get regular medical appointments to make sure that your child was healthy, right? Or that your pregnancy was going well, you could submit those. If you received any sort of assistance for your children, like food stamps or WIC, you could use that to show that you've been here. It gets a little tougher, right? For people who might have been working without being properly employed or officially employed, right? So how do you show that you were working here? Or people who maybe didn't have like an official like lease, right? How do you show that you were actually here? Those people, if they were sending money back to their home country, they could also use receipts from that money they sent over to show that they were here.
Thank you, Veronica. I think that sort of going into them and giving the examples, I think we've also heard very creative things happening in our community. I think we're just reminded, right, that our immigrant communities are very resourceful, resilient, and they figure it out. I heard from the community some folks are some gamers, that folks who are frequent gamers and they are always on either like Xbox, like different Xbox or PS4, PS5 sort of systems, that they've even downloaded receipts from those sort of interactions, right?
Yeah, they have, especially now when we're ordering everything online. A lot of people have printed out their like Amazon, receipts for getting things at their apartment, and they use those to prove that they've been here. Yeah, if you are a gamer and you spend a whole year in your room playing games, right, you could submit receipts from those gaming subscriptions or other things that prove. Some things that are not as strong, right, we could say, but you could definitely use in pairing them with other forms of documentation are, pictures. If you took a trip to, the Golden Gate Bridge and there's a picture with a stamped date on it and they could show that, it was the Golden Gate Bridge and you were in California, you might be able to use that with maybe some medical records to complete the year, right? So people definitely get creative. We've also heard of people using like older applications. So maybe my brother applied for DACA and seeing what he submitted to kind of get ideas of what I could submit, right, with my application.
Yeah, and I think that from just as we're wrapping up this conversation, I think that DACA in particular requires a lot of. I mean, I think all immigration applications require a lot of documentation, but I think DACA there's a special level of amount of documents one has to complete. And I think that maybe a tip that we can give to folks, because I know a lot of folks right now are trying to connect with service providers to start their application, but I think that applicants can start being almost proactive before they even start their application or before they even meet with the service provider to start getting these documents. So just to sort of review just the continuous residence, you talked about one document for every 3 months, right? That's sort of the best practice. Since 2007, I think that folks can almost create. I've seen people in the community create charts, and there are other charts online that we'll talk about right now where folks can access. But I think that would be a great tip that we can give the community, right, as a way to sort of start being proactive and start getting these documents ready to go. Because as we can imagine, there are hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of folks who may be wanting to apply for DACA. So I think folks can start beating folks or start getting a little ahead of the curve by getting these documents, right, Vero?
Yeah, definitely. I think, when you go speak to a legal service provider, the best thing you could do is bring them all the information they will need to help you with your case, right? So if you already have some of these documents, right, or you already know which years are going to be hard for you to prove that you've been here in the United States, it's great if you bring what you have and you let them know where you might need help, because it's easier constructing, one piece of that time versus like 14 years of that time, right? If you know that you had contact with the police, right, and you might want that to get reviewed by someone, it'd be great if you could go and get that document already and come to your consultation with that already in place. And like you mentioned, Abraham, using a table to kind of keep track of what you have and where you're missing is a great thing to have. Also, as you start organizing your documents, you could start putting them in order of year, right? You could start with June 2007 and then go all the way up to February 2021. And then put maybe a sticky note where you are missing information, right? Or a sticky note to separate the years. And all of that would make your advocate's life so much more, easier to help you and guide you with your application. And you don't have to go and create these tables. A lot of great organizations have tables that could help you have documents where you could just check things off so that you know what you're missing and what you might still need as you move forward with this packet.
Yeah, thank you for that, Vero. Just to wrap up, just one final note that we could make is we talk a lot. I think you sort of ended on a perfect jumping point that we can go to, is that we actually have a lot of these resources online on our own website. If folks visit the ILRC/DACA, you'll find a lot of what we talked about today, whether it be the requirements. We have charts that are helpful for folks. We have the overview of the DACA program, eligibility requirements, etc. So if folks want to visit our website, we have a lot of these resources that we referenced a lot in both of the videos. So I invite folks to, again, just visit that website, share it on your social media platforms, because I feel like even if we're not undocumented or potentially documented, we have family, friends, community members that we interact with that could potentially benefit from these resources. So again, I just invite folks to visit and share that link, the ilrc.org/DACA, where you'll find a lot of these resources that we think will be beneficial to the community. Having said that, Beto, go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to add something around documentation. Like we've been saying, it's hard to put together 14 years of your life if you haven't been keeping track of that. But I just want to, say that as you're putting this together, don't self-exclude evidence. Don't say, I don't think this meets it, right? I would still put it in your packet and let the advocate that's helping you, guide you through whether it would be enough or not enough to use what you have. And just take it in. I would also wanted just the last note that the evidence that you submit, just be careful what information is in that evidence that you submit in the documentation. So it's great if you have it reviewed by someone who understands and knows immigration law, like we talked about in part 1, who's able to give legal advice, just so that what's presented for you is the best possible package that you could put together.
Perfect. I think that's a great note to sort of end this series. I want to thank you, Veronica, for being with me today and going over this. I'm sorry, and I hope this 2-part video series is helpful to community members. Again, we invite folks to share these videos on social media, share it with family and friends, and let's just continue advocating for all immigrants and just continue to just make sure we keep these conversations going. Having said that, my name is Abraham again. Thank you very much for being with us today, and we hope everybody has a great rest of their day.